Hello everyone, and welcome to this symposium on the impact of COVID-19 on arts professionals. Just a couple of very quick housekeeping things before we get started. A reminder to everyone that all ISPS sessions are being recorded. These are for ISPS delegates only. And secondly, a reminder to the presenters that we're going to stick really strictly to time. So we'll have 20 minutes for presentation, 5 minutes for Q&A, and then a little bit of a handover comfort break in between speakers. So I'm going to say very little at this point, other than what a delight it is to introduce 3 colleagues to speak in this symposium, and first of all to welcome Netta Spiro to take the floor. Thanks, Netta.
Thanks, Rosie. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. So as Rosie said, welcome to today's symposium, the impact of COVID-19 on arts professionals. The papers in this symposium all come from work on an AHRC funded project called Arts Professional: The Health, Economic and Social Impact of COVID-19 on Professionals in the Arts. Arts Professional is based at the Centre for Performance Science, which is a partnership of the Royal College of Music and Imperial College London, and it's in collaboration with researchers at Imperial College London and at the University of Arts London. And it's also supported by national representative bodies within the arts and culture sectors. So I'll give a brief introduction to the project and then run straight into the first talk of the symposium, which will be given by me. Our starting point with this project was that professionals in the arts face unprecedented and urgent challenges to their health, well-being and livelihoods as a result of COVID-19, let alone what was happening before. And we noted in our grant application that with communities prevented from gathering for arts and cultural exchanges and artists isolated, the aim of Arts Professional was to provide knowledge, leadership, advocacy and interdisciplinary exchange at this vital and rapidly changing time for the sector. So throughout today's symposium, in the question sections, we'd gladly hear about what, if anything, most strikes you as important and useful to you from these findings. You'll see some members of the team during the symposium. Shaughnessy will present on the future of the cultural workforce, then George Waddell will present on changes in technology use to engage with the arts among public and arts professionals. And you've already seen Rosie Perkins, who's chairing the session. Everyone I've mentioned so far is at the Centre for Performance Science, along with Erin Williamman, who I'm sure you all know. The others are from different places and backgrounds. Afric Campbell, who's here today, is an author and lecturer in science, culture and society at Imperial College, and Vali Laliotti and Sophia Pali work at the creative computing at the University of Arts London. So as you can see, it's quite a multidisciplinary team. The project was preceded by work at the RCM that's connected. So there was a research project of musical impact that investigated the demands of music making with the aim of enhancing musicians' health and well-being. Then there was the Healthy Conservatoires Network, which is still ongoing, which aims to inspire the creation of educational and professional environments that promote health and well-being. And Hearts, which investigated the impact of arts and culture on health and well-being from individual, social and economic perspectives. As part of Hearts, we created a survey that looked at connections between engagement in arts and culture on one hand and health and well-being outcomes on the other. And when COVID struck, my computer's being funny. When COVID struck, we began a large-scale survey in the arts and culture sectors to determine precisely where challenges lie and how they evolve as the situation unfolded. This survey used a lot of the social and well-being measures as well as demographic information we developed in the Hearts survey. And this survey became one strand of the then funded Hearts Professional project. I'll talk more about that survey as part of the first talk of the symposium, but for now to that strand we added 3 more. So strand 2 includes responsive qualitative studies in arts and culture sectors and survey studies. You'll hear about some of that work in the next 2 talks. And then strand 3 champions innovative responses to the crisis through a series of multimedia case studies made available as examples of good practice. And finally, strand 4 examines the role of digital innovation and rapid design in sharing and driving forward good practice to ensure that workers in the arts and culture sectors have digital tools available to interact, sustain their work and serve their communities. Our purpose with all this, as I've said, is to be helpful to professionals in the arts. So if you can see ways in which this work can be used for good, do bring this up in questions after the talk. So to the first talk, snapshots of work and well-being of arts professionals in the UK during COVID-19. We now know from large-scale studies that the impact of COVID has been swift and dramatic. For example, in 2019, the music industry contributed £5.8 billion to the UK economy. And in 2020, the music industry contributed 3.1 billion to the UK economy. So that's a decrease of about 46%. And overall employment in the music industry dropped by 35% from 2019 to 2020. At the start of COVID, we feared that COVID would affect arts professionals, but we didn't know how or what would happen. So we started asking people using that survey I mentioned. We wanted to cast the net wide to ask people from a range of arts professions. And in addition to health and well-being questions that I mentioned earlier, we asked them about their work and income, COVID, and some open questions. In phase one, in April to June 2020, we contacted individuals and organisations and used social media, and we published the findings earlier this year. A year later, as the UK began to unlock in April to May 2021, we recontacted the same participants and contacted a bunch of new people, and this will be phase two of the data collection that I'll report on today. We kept the survey broadly the same between the two phases, but we did add questions about long COVID and vaccination, obviously things we didn't know about so much at the beginning. And we also added a new questions about the future, which was, do you anticipate a future for yourself working in the arts and cultural sectors? In this phase, we used an online platform called Prolific. Thank you, Caitlin, for all the work on that. And today we'll focus mainly on the results from phase two, but I'll put them in context of the results from phase one. We could ask several research questions with this data set. For today, we'll focus on two. What are the relationships between performing arts professionals' profiles and measures of their mental and social well-being? And what predicts performing artists seeing themselves as having a future in the arts? So who are our participants? Well, for the second phase, we had over 80% of the participants were new. So that's probably slightly misleading. So 80% of this 685 are new participants. But we did manage a notch better in the second phase in terms of spread, although still about 2/3 are female, slightly younger age range than before, so an average age of 38 years, marginally less white proportion, people self-identifying as white ethnicities at 89%, and compared to phase one, slightly a reduction in the higher degrees, and a slight increase in people who had tested positive or had had symptoms of COVID. In terms of the professions that we managed to reach, in the first phase, we were very much focused on music and sound arts and performing arts. But by the second phase, we managed to have almost 1/3 of music and sound arts professionals, almost 1/3 of performing arts, almost half visual and decorative arts, but only 11% from literature. And we can talk about that in the questions. So what did we find? So just very generally, in answer to the question, do you consider yourself in financial hardship as the result of the pandemic? Already in phase one, we had 54% people saying yes to that question. And by phase two, we had 59%. We can break that down now by professional area. The keen-eyed among you will see that we're able to now break down the visual and decorative arts category into three. So we've got crafts, decorative arts, and visual arts. That's possible only for phase two, really, because of our spread. But we do get quite small numbers in some of those categories. The numbers, indeed, at the top of each bar are the number of people who identified themselves as working purely in one of these areas. And then there are some people who identified themselves as working in more than one, and those can be seen in the second bar along. And you can see they aren't evenly distributed. But with that in mind, about 75% of those 126 saying they're working purely in the performing arts said yes to the question of, do you consider yourself to be in financial hardship as a result of the pandemic? And only 30% did so for literature. And as Africa and I were discussing just before we started, there can be a multitude of reasons for these patterns and these differences across the groups that I'd be happy to talk about in the discussion at the end. But with that as a sobering background, to address the first research question, we looked at the relationship between performing arts professionals' profiles and measures of mental and social well-being. And so to do that, we looked at regressions. In terms of profile, what do we mean? Well, we had 3 groups of variables, kind of pandemic specific variables, exercise change compared to pre-COVID. So did you do more exercise during COVID than before? Financial hardship as a result of COVID, and change in socializing. So did you socialize more or less in the last month as affected by COVID, either online or in person? And then we had a group of variables that was to do with demographics, a couple to do with health and exercise pre-COVID, and then a group of variables to do with kind of long-term finances and work. So we'll look here just at a summary of the associations that we see through these regressions. The outcome variables are across the top and key variables are down the side here. Oh, hello. And an upward arrow is a positive association. So higher score on well-being with an increase in exercise, for example. And a downward is a negative association, so a lower score on loneliness. But obviously, lower score of loneliness is not a bad thing. So upwards in these 2 columns is generally what we're looking for, and downwards in these 2 columns is generally what we're looking for. We'll see now, and those are coloured in green, and we'll see that most of this table gets coloured in green. So we see, if we look at exercise, that more rather than less exercise before COVID is connected to positive mental and social measures and reduced loneliness in the first phase of data collection. More exercise during COVID compared to before was connected to better outcomes across all measures. Better self-rated health was connected with better outcomes from mental well and ill health. Here's our red. Worse financial situation was connected to worse outcomes on mental well and ill health and loneliness. Older age was connected to better outcomes across all measures. And we didn't find anything that's significant in terms of changes in socializing. So then if we add phase 2, so the more recent data collection, we see that changes in socializing do become significant for both mental health and social connectedness, and we're pretty close on depression as well. This might be connected to timing. We're now a year into more or less restricted lives at this point. Health becomes significant across the board, but overall things are very consistent between the 2 phases. There are a couple of other associations that are coming up as significant for individual outcomes, so gender and depression, living alone and loneliness. But here we're just focusing on things that are significant across more than one outcome measure. So generally speaking, greater physical activity before lockdown, increase in physical activity during lockdown or COVID since, better self-rated health, not being in financial hardship as a result of COVID, being older, and not having reduction in socializing are all associated with better outcome. Turning to our second research question, what predicts performing artists seeing themselves as having a future in the arts? In response to the question, do you anticipate a future of yourself working in the arts and cultural sectors? A very small proportion said no, only 3%. This might be a selection bias issue. This is a long survey, and why would you fill it out if you're very sure you're leaving the profession? But almost 30% are saying not at the moment or maybe. To look at the glass 70% full, 70% are saying yes, that they do anticipate a future for themselves working in the arts and cultural sectors. So to look at what could be predicted, these responses, we did another regression. I say we, Geordie did this and the last one, he's in the room as well today and is presenting later. This time it's an ordinal logistic regression. And we had 4 groups of predictors. And we added these variables in groups. So the first groups are health and well-being. The second are to do with finances and employment. The third is to do with demographics, and the fourth is to do with arts. And we add each new group with each model, but we keep all the previous ones in the model each time. This time, the things that are coming up as significant are in green. So in model 1, we see association between higher scores on well-being and connection to others in the arts on one hand, and being more confident in the future in the arts in the other. But once we introduce new variables of model 2, that overrides everything else that we've seen already. And the primary drivers now become the degree to which individuals already were seeing higher percentage of income via the arts before the pandemic, and ability to maintain their skills, which may correlate highly with them actually continuing to work. We haven't done that analysis yet. And to a smaller degree, those who are involved in more freelance work tended to be more likely to be expecting to stay in the profession. Models 3 and 4, so demographics and art specialism, didn't contribute even when entered into the model first. So to put it really simply, the best predictors of anticipating a future in the arts seem to be financial and perhaps connected with opportunities. So in summary, the mental and social well-being models seem to be replicable, even under different circumstances. So a year into the pandemic, with an expanded sample, so new participants, and broadening out the range of arts professionals, you saw that in phase 1 we were really focusing, despite our best efforts, on music and sound arts and performing arts, but we managed to broaden out more in the second phase. So it seems that these measures might be resistant to circumstances, which might strengthen their construct and convergent validity and reliability. But we have seen that the situations in phase 1 and phase 2, so April to June 2020 and April to May 2021, weren't identical. And we're seeing increased roles of general health and social connections for people's sense of well-being, which we can talk about in the questions. I think is a really interesting observation. And perhaps not so surprising, we're seeing in response to our second research question, the importance of financial considerations for whether people are anticipating staying in the profession. We collected much more data in this survey. It's very long, so there's plenty more that we can look at. At the very least, we can be much more fine-grained, at least in our descriptives. So at the moment in this analysis so far, we really lumped together very big groups of professionals, but we have information about specialisms, so different kinds of performing artists, different kinds of musicians. And we also have information about what people have been doing, so teaching, performing, writing, and so on. So that might help make the analysis a little bit more fine-grained. The survey included both closed and open questions about finance and support, and Rosie and Caitlin have been working on the open questions. We won't be reporting that today, but just for today, I thought it might be helpful to point out that this survey kind of tries to bring together broad brush numeric impressions with more nuanced individual perspectives. Most obviously, in terms of future work, obviously, it'd be very helpful to have longitudinal work to track change in a consistent sample over time. We can do a little bit of comparison between phase 1 and phase 2, but looking forward, collecting new data consistently will be very, very helpful. So thank you to our participants, to the HRC, thank you to you for being here online at whatever time of day it is for you. As I said, other members of the team are here and might join the discussion. We're at very early stages of analysis, so we happily hear gut reactions, questions, and connections with other work. Handing back to you, Rosie, I guess.
Thank you so much, Netta. So we'll move now into a 5-minute or so discussion period. If you'd like to ask a question, please either pop it in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and we'll take it from there.
Or if there's anyone from the team that would like to jump in with all the many things that we've discussed and I missed for time, then you're very welcome.
Maybe I can kick off, Netta, just with something that has struck me as interesting as we've been sort of working with these data around the freelance nature of work, sort of being associated with this feeling of remaining in the profession. I wonder what your sort of gut response is to that, and whether there's anything else in the data that sort of speaks to it or might help us to understand that association.
Yeah, Geordie and I actually had a brief discussion about this while we were doing the analysis, and we haven't done a thorough investigation of what the data says, but our gut was in the context of freelancers have to do a lot of work to maintain being part of the profession and continuing anyway, and that was happening way before COVID. So there might be something to do with just being used to that uncertainty one notch more, being used to having to adapt, being used to kind of fighting for everything just one notch more. So that it might be to do with that. But I think there'll be lots to do. I don't know, throwing it back at you, I don't know if there's anything in the qual side of things that's coming out in that context, or whether we just need to ask much more directed questions about that. I also think that we should be very careful. Now we're in a position that we weren't in with the last phase, that we can really look at coincidence between the category of professional and whether they're freelance or not. Like, does it feel very different to be freelance in one of those subcategories than in another?
Yeah, absolutely. And Viv's commenting that it brings up the sense of sort of identity and freelancing. And I think in the next paper that Caitlin will be presenting, we do talk quite a lot about early career professionals' sense of what being a freelancer is like and what it's been like in COVID, and how that intersects with what it was like before and how it might be in the future. So stay tuned for presentation 2, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. So we have a couple of minutes before we take a short break. Are there any other comments or questions from the floor, or any other contributions from the team? Yes, Susanna, please.
Hello. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I followed your first survey as well with great interest, because it's really interesting work. So I wanted to ask you, did you have a chance yet to do any within subjects comparisons of those people who did participate in your first survey?
It's about to happen, but we haven't done it yet. I think it's striking that we managed to get only quite a small group to come back to us, which I mean, it's a long and boring survey and all the rest of it, but I think it's also just a really tough survey and a tough topic. So I think that's already informative in some way. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what if anything we see in that kind of repeated sample. We do have a tiny little third data set in between the two. So there's a very, very small group that did all three, and we'll have to see whether we've got enough data there to do something with, because it would be really interesting if we can to track kind of those time points during that first year. Yeah, thank you for the question, Geordie. We've got to get on this. Yeah, it'd be interesting and important.
Thank you, Netta. Afrik, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this just before you started, but it really strikes me listening to Nita. We're actually edging to even more of a crisis in literature than I might have thought. But I think one of the big questions that is going to come out of this is the separation of categories within the arts. Literature is beset with problems because of things like Amazon dominance, contract issues, and writers' earnings have been in decline for years, down 42% since 2005, between 2005 and 2017. And in the sense that, books at least are one of the, largest consumption products that we have compared to, for example, theatre, which is expensive. So the discounting effect in books means that writers have already started to adapt to this idea of financial hardship by picking up other employment. And I think that's really important. I mean, what I was saying before was, as a writer, you could sit at home like everybody did for hundreds of years and write a book and still have a job and keep going. So there is this, and publishers and agents are well aware of this. So, and there's plenty of competition. I think that there's a sort of, in a sense, a class divide here that we're going to see, where more and more people who move into literature are people who are being funded either by their parents if they're young students, or by, supported by other forces. It's difficult to see how this won't happen. In talking to the literature-based industries, the Creative Industries Federation, the Society of Authors here, you do see this, that there was already a crisis, and this has just made it worse. It was also in theatre interesting to hear that I think the CEO or one of the senior figures, the Bridge Theatre in the Today programme this morning, talking about, they still can't get enough people back to the theatre. Now, one might argue that, of course, theatre prices are incredibly expensive and it's only middle-class people who can afford to do it. But I wonder if there's going to be a repricing of product as well as a recategorization. And this is all without, all the parents who are saying to young entrants coming into the market, for God's sake, get a proper job and don't go into the arts. So it'd be quite interesting to see how that, once we're past what looks like the crisis, that actually there's a deeper crisis about the arts sector underneath.
Yeah, there's so much of this that seems to be uncovering, as many of people have said, uncovering things that are already there and exacerbating maybe, but fundamental issues that we have to deal with.
Thank you very much, Netta. We're going to take a 3-minute or so break now, and we will start again at 13:30 London time. So in about 3 minutes time. See you shortly.
Guidelines. Can you see that, Rosie?
Yes, Caitlin. Yeah, that's fine. Hi everyone, welcome back to this symposium on the impact of COVID-19 on arts professionals. May I please just remind everyone to remain mute when you're not presenting. Thank you, just to avoid background noise. And it's a pleasure now to introduce the second paper in this symposium, which will be led and introduced by Caitlin Shaughnessy. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thanks, Rosie. So as Meta said earlier, this work is part of the Arts Professional Project, and this particular research looked at early career workers following on from the paper earlier, which kind of saw that age was a predictor for well-being and financial hardship during the pandemic. And so we wanted to really see how early career workers experience the pandemic and also how they view and situated themselves in the industry going forward. So as I said before, this was built from the background that unemployment seemed to be, particularly at the start of the pandemic, falling on younger workers. And we know really within the arts that early careers are already characterised by short-term contracts and unstable work, which is more likely to be vulnerable to disruption. And as Netta has already shown, those that are younger are more likely to have adverse financial and wellbeing experiences. So in terms of participants, we interviewed 16 early career artists. The majority of these were under 30, but we also had some who'd made later career transitions as well. We tried to also get a variance within the years, so some were only a few years out of college or conservatoire, and others were kind of 8 or 9 years more established within the profession. But most importantly, all were within 10 years of their career, which kind of corresponds to the lifespan perspective of how we define early career. So they were also from a range of industries and disciplines, from musicians and composers to filmmakers, actors working in theatre and film, as well as authors, poets, and those working in circus arts. For most, their careers were kind of a portfolio with a range of directing, producing, and performing work, so mostly freelance, which, as we expect, changed quite significantly during the pandemic. We recruited from a range of professional networks through social media, through organisations such as BAPAM and Equity to try and get as a diverse a spread as possible. And the interviews were conducted during May and June of 2021. So roughly when things were opening up in the UK, but still quite tentative, there was still a fair amount of uncertainty as to social distancing and what things would look like. And a lot of people were still not fully vaccinated yet. So we chose interviews as a way to kind of get the most in-depth responses from the participants. We used thematic analysis to analyse these, using the approach defined by Braun and Clark, which is fairly well established, of going through initial codes and then developing these into themes through a kind of reflexive process of coding. As the previous paper showed, we have a general idea of kind of the macro level of arts experiences. So our aim here was to really zoom in much more depth on the individual experiences of early career participants and give voices to that experience, but also to identify the similarities and differences across the range of professions and whether there were differences between them. So throughout the analysis, we found 3 overarching themes that really reflect upon the participants' experiences over the pandemic and also its impacts for the future. Our first theme, pandemic precarity and creative practice, really reflects upon the disruptions and impacts of the pandemic on their immediate careers. This included the working patterns that were changed during lockdown and their particular vulnerabilities as freelance workers and how they responded to this. There was a sense that these relationships changed as they went through the pandemic, and as freelancers, they were able to kind of get a pause from this hustle that they kind of experienced as young freelance workers. There was also a lot of criticism of the structural supports that were put in place during the pandemic, with lots of freelancers falling through the gap and this sense of invisibility of these particular workers in the eyes of government policy. And as the previous paper has shown, there was a clear disruption to their professional lives and the way that they were able to earn money. Our second theme, which is inclusivity and diversifying audiences, kind of looks ahead towards how the participants viewed the industry in the future. There were emphasis on the problems with the current states of diversity and inclusivity within the sector, which, although it seems to be a high priority, nothing tangible has really changed. And the participants really felt that the pandemic provided a crucial point to address this change, because in some ways it had made things worse, but in other ways it had also provided opportunities to make things better, particularly how changing modes of engagement can be kind of harnessed to really promote inclusivity in the future. It's shown that these changes are not that difficult, but we just need to make sure they're maintained. And finally, our third theme, adapting, developing and disrupting cultural practices, places kind of a greater emphasis on looking forward towards what audiences and performance might look like in the future and what the early career professionals really wanted from the future of their careers. There were real frustrations with the normative ways of performing in the cultural institutions, and the pandemic had showed how these disruptions and possibilities for change can be really exciting, particularly kind of changing the persisting models of elitism and ableism that have so long dominated the cultural industries. Despite lots of want and need for change, they don't always come through in practice. So what was really found across the participants, that the impact of the pandemic was to turn up the dial and amplify a lot of the problems that already existed. As early career performers, the experiences of kind of grabbing work where you can and financial hardship were only too common. The quote here about "don't worry, we're old poor" kind of highlights these problems of unstable or no work and picking up random jobs. And for many, the pandemic just saw a return to these practices, and frustratingly, a real step back on the ladder that they thought they had just climbed and got out of these patterns. And with both the second and the third themes as well, there's a sense that the pandemic had really accelerated these changes for good or for worse. And this was a critical point to try and change that. So I'm going to take you on a kind of a whistle-stop tour through the themes before considering what the feelings of the participants can have and the implications for policy. So within our first theme, the first sub-theme focuses on the clear and immediate impacts of the pandemic. So as expected, there was a huge impact on the initial work, with everything planned just stopping, and the financial implications of this metaphor of kind of everything up in the air and grasping and taking anything was almost universal. And whilst many were able to adapt, take jobs as delivery drivers or writing subtitles or picking up a lot more teaching, there was a real concern about the impact upon the opportunities and networking. So the lost opportunities that never happened, the plays and the projects that were never commissioned, the contacts that were never made because of the lack of these meetings. And this was a more worrying factor for their future career development and how they could continue to get work going forward with this lost portfolio. So the second sub-theme revealed the perceptions of support received from government and industry. There was real anger, as you can tell, at the support that was received from the government, with many freelancers falling through the cracks. There was also a sense that there was no trickle down, that there'd been a big emphasis on the cultural institutions, but this didn't necessarily fall through to the freelancers, the front of house staff, those that worked for those cultural institutions. And there was also this sense of a willing ignorance, or a sense of the government not wanting to know. And within the wider context of kind of defunding the arts, this was seen as kind of a direct attitude of the government to not support the arts. But there was also community growth in contrast to this, and a sense that the industry pulled together. This third sub-theme really touches on the precarity of the freelance working cultures that existed and how these patterns made them more vulnerable during the pandemic. It made them reconsider how they were working and the patterns of work and the impact that that was having. This emphasis on the hustle and moving from one job to the next kind of made them unaware of the unsustainability of these practices in the long term, and maybe how they could become better artists and develop their artistic identities rather than random musicians going from gig to gig, or troubadours, as this musician stated. So building on this previous theme, the fourth sub-theme here highlighted how proactivity and adaptability was really needed as a freelancer, and also provided some resilience to the situation. And it led to an expansion of this kind of individual proactivity. Instead of waiting for projects to come along and joining that, they started thinking more about who they were as artists and giving them a kick to create their own things, being more proactive on their individual projects and thinking about how they can market themselves. And finally, within this first theme, they also reflected upon the wider considerations that this pause created in terms of their well-being. So across the board, it looks like this is not actually specific to the arts, and maybe the entire pandemic has given people an opportunity to reflect on their own goals and happiness, and how their current career paths are really contributing to that. So the participants reflected how some parts of their practice were really important in terms of kind of the physicality of their circus work and the joy they got from performing, but also kind of the stress and the being burnt out from the 6 nights of performing a week or kind of gigging around the country, and how they could potentially change this to really improve their practice, improve their well-being, and become better artists as a result. So this second theme really looks at how the participants emphasize the changing attitudes on inclusivity and diversifying audiences. So this first sub-theme emphasizes how the barriers to inclusivity are really tied to the negative assumptions and prejudice about what the arts is for, and that kind of came through during people's responses to the arts during the pandemic. For example, those retrain adverts with the ballerina and things like that were seen as emblematic of the fact that people don't see it as valuable, and this also impacts upon pathways for access and who goes into the arts because it's not seen as a valuable career. So touching on that, this second theme as well of elitism, accessibility and inequality, the participants really felt that there was an importance and a drive to nurture this and provide long-term solution to access barriers. In the context of the pandemic, they were very concerned that this would accentuate divisions within the industry, particularly because of the financial instability and the critical factor that plays in kind of accentuating inequality. And also the fact that as funding gets cut in education and particularly in arts sectors, those pathways for access earlier on in education would also be cut, and this would have further impacts upon accessibility and inequality. And finally, there was also an emphasis on the importance of preserving some of the outreach possibilities that had been revealed during the pandemic and widening audiences to kind of preserve the arts and ensure its longevity, really. It's been shown that during the pandemic, we can be accessible, we can change and morph the ways that we are performing, but there is a frustration with funders and the Arts Council that these are not always recognised. Engaging on social media and platforms like that are not seen as being accessible in the way that bringing people into theatre spaces and diversifying audiences that way is recognised as traditional kind of accessibility and reaching out. There's a need now to go beyond the sense of static place, as the pandemic has shown. So in this final theme, it kind of looked forward at models of arts production, dissemination and performance and how these are going to change. So in this first theme, it was really reflected that participants had experienced a change in awareness of cultural importance. This was both in the way that the artists and public viewed themselves and also in the role of the arts. So everyone stuck at home, engaging in crafting and watching TV, and there was some kind of this disconnect between the attitudes of government and the heightened engagement of everyone at home, and everyone sitting watching Netflix, but not necessarily recognizing that this is engaging with culture. And as part of this as well, there was a recognition of the growing mental health crisis and the impact of lockdowns, and a feeling that the arts can help address this gap. So participants also emphasised the importance of retaining these adaptive and hybrid creative models for multiple factors, and recognising how the arts can reach out beyond these normative spaces of theatres and concert halls. This is particularly for accessibility needs. This needs to be kept to kind of promote access to the arts, but also these models need to be promoted to make sure there's fair remuneration for them. It also, as this quotation demonstrates, allows more artistic independence, allows the artists to get closer to the audiences and really engage more flexibly with them. And an additional point that was made by some as well is the importance of considering the environmental impact of traditional models of touring and dissemination, and how going on tour to Europe for months at a time is not necessarily, is not environmentally sustainable. And finally, the final sub-theme is the sense that creativity is really being cut out from this drive to make money, and that profitability is put ahead of kind of more creative aspects. So putting a couple of famous names on stage may sell out the seats, but doesn't really necessarily do anything to kind of advance and push boundaries. And that those kind of tensions really need to be resolved if we want kind of a creative future. So combined, the kind of experiences of the participants capture an early year career workforce that while is really committed and engaged with their creative practice, they also seek a more equitable, fairer and diverse industry that protects artists and engage more flexibly with broader audiences. They've got a really strong sense of social responsibility and want an independence and control over their artistic practice. They have clear priorities in terms of their own well-being and maintaining the balances between work and health. They're digital natives and can really navigate these online and hybrid performances very creatively. They just want fair and equitable support for them to continue to ensure the accessibility and promote the reach of their work. And they're also passionate about early inclusion and really sustainably reaching into schools and making an impact with children who will be, again, the future of the creative workforce. In terms of policy implications, we need long-term funding models to support career development, making sure that pay protections remain, such as equity minimums. And if projects are only 2 weeks long, how is that really going to develop an early career artist? Ensure there's multi-level networks and recognizing that the lack of experience in these first 2 years and how we can kind of help them catch up from that. Ensure there's sustainable and more creative outreach methods. So for example, utilizing social media and things like that to continue to diversify both the artists and the audiences that come in. And also focus on this sense of artistic citizenship. The participants in the study were clearly very focused and dedicated to the impact of their own practice, but how can we also help cultural organisations to support this and look at how the arts can be put to work to create a positive transformation in people's lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. I'd like to invite questions or comments from the floor. Please either pop them into the chat or raise your virtual hand. Well, maybe I'll kick things off, Caitlin. Obviously, you and I have spoken about this a lot, but listening to it again, it strikes me that this sort of disruption or this opportunity for change is a moment of opportunity. And I wondered if you got a sense from the participants when you were speaking with them about how optimistic or not they felt about being the agents of that sort of change or that disruption.
I think it was mixed. They were very passionate about their own kind of motivations. There was just a sense of real frustration with kind of the overarching structures that prevented it from happening. And as you're talking about, sometimes the freelance aspect of it meant that they did have more agency than some of those who were more tied to theatre companies.
Yeah, thank you. And Jane, I see you have a hand up. You're on mute, Jane.
Caitlin, I put my question in the chat, and actually it's a very short question. It's, could you remind us how old your early career artists were? What were the criteria?
So it was within the first 10 years of their career, and across that we had some that were 2 to 3 years out and some that were kind of approaching 9 years. And most of them were kind of under 30, but there were some that had kind of transitioned later on, but were still only kind of 3 years in, but had made later career changes. But I can't remember the reference of the it's a lifespan perspective career where they're very much like it's the first 10 years. So
thank you so much. Most of what I wanted to say is comment rather than question, and I just really wanted to say thank you so much for such a really great presentation. Susanna will be talking later on about the research that we've been doing, and we focused deliberately on mid-career and late career musicians. And what was striking was that so many of them expressed a concern for younger artists, and in fact we asked them what advice they would give to younger artists now. But my sense is that our participants could learn a lot from your participants. There's something very warming about their sense of social responsibility and their thoughts for the future of the profession. So thank you very much indeed for some really excellent work.
I think we were chatting with Rose about this as well, is that there is a generational sense here as well, particularly among the younger artists, that generationally they do seem to be more socially responsible, because of that's the environment they've grown up in, and maybe that has also had an impact.
I'm sure you're right. That's it. It's a really good point to make.
Hi, Rosie, if I could just, listening to Caitlin's really interesting talk, I mean, something that comes up here is when you mentioned Netflix, you know, how we survived, is something to do in the UK, it seems to me, as somebody who's not from the UK, an awareness of the value of arts that is not properly understood. I mean, at a sort of level of society. I mean, we know that there's a history of underfunding of the arts. There's a culture of underfunding, and that's not going to get better in the short term. But my sense is that one thing that all of these artists have is we don't have a body. We have individual bodies like the Society of Authors, or different guilds, etc. How we would raise public awareness of the fact that the stuff that is keeping you entertained is being produced by artists. I think there's a lot of myth around. People think that being in the arts is really glamorous, therefore there must be money attached, and there isn't a great awareness of actually how much people are really on the breadline.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was some of them expressed this idea that the pandemic had kind of changed that, because it brought down the curtain, because you were seeing like when celebrities were giving interviews on breakfast TV, they were in their own homes, and it kind of took away that sheen of it being really glamorous, and the same for kind of grassroots arts as well. But yeah, there was a real sense of frustration that people were saying, go and get a 9-to-5 job, don't be in the arts, and then would watch Netflix for 4 hours every single evening. And the lack of communication between how these things are produced.
Well, there's an irony there, isn't it, that artists' lives are perceived as being glamorous, and in fact vastly underpaid. And I wonder if there's also a big question, a couple of the people you spoke to about the middleman, this idea of the agent, whoever is in between the provider and the artist. I think that's been quite a revelation, in the sense that as artists upskill and can promote themselves on social media, do you really need to be paying 12.5% or whatever to the agent that is running you?
Yeah, that's an interesting point as to whether they'll kind of continue. I think touching on that as well, is that some of the qualitative responses from the survey is that whilst younger professionals are much more adept at kind of utilizing social media to do all of that, some older career artists feel very uncomfortable with using social media. And how can we kind of better support them as well to kind of engage in the same ways and widen their reach?
For sure.
And just picking up on a comment in the chat here from Viv, saying also sadly the time frame for experienced artists, craftspeople hanging in there before being forced out. Are these skills going to be lost forever? Maybe more of a rhetorical question than one we necessarily have to address now, but yes.
But I think that's a really important point, because in general, I'm seriously generalizing, but the younger entrants are more fluent, more literate in technology, better at picking up Instagram and curating their spaces. And there is it becomes a new form of elitism, those who are technologically fluent, and therefore will be allowed by the middleman to promote themselves. And that relationship between the agent and the creator is really critical. But technology is also the opportunity that allows you to become upskilled. So the more literate the artist becomes, the more independence they can gain.
Would anyone like to comment on that, or have a final question for Caitlin? If not, I think, oh yes, Sarah, would you like to come in?
Yes, sorry about that. I wonder, Caitlin, if there was anything in your research that indicated as artists were coming to see some opportunities that they might not have seen before and taking advantage of those opportunities. Any question about how they could be trained or prepared for those opportunities, either by their schooling or in professional development? Any call for new training?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a new call, but the idea that conservatoires need to properly prepare them for freelance life, and the fact that you do become a producer, you become a director, you become all of these things when you're trying to create particularly if you're trying to create your own show or do your own practice and things like that they are not necessarily prepared for when they first step out, and instead they end up doing so many different things rather than really creating a proper artistic identity and artistic image that they can then put out into the world.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you for all of the questions. We'll take just a very quick 2-minute handover break now, and we will start the third paper at 1400 London time. See you shortly. Geordie, is that your screen now sharing?
Yes, that's right.
Great. Hello again, welcome back to the symposium on the impact of COVID-19 on arts professionals. We'll move now to the third and final presentation this side of the break. And this is going to be looking at changing uses of technology in relation to engagement with the arts during the pandemic, led by George Waddell. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Rosie. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So for those just joining us in the session, we're speaking about research under the banner of the Hearts Project, in particular the Hearts Professional Project. So this is looking at the health, economic, and social impact of the arts, and more specifically within Hearts Professional, looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on professionals working within the arts. We've already heard in the first talk of our first work package, the large-scale surveys that are being done of arts professionals. We're turning now to the sort of responsive follow-up studies we're conducting within the project in response to what we've been seeing happen around us in the past months. This is then followed by 2 other work packages that I'll touch on very briefly at the end of this presentation. But coming to these responsive follow-up studies, so we've just heard Caitlin talk about the particular challenges met by early career researchers. This is something we've been seeing sort of coming from all sides. Well, something else that we really felt we needed to address within this project was the role of technology. Because of course, in this pandemic, and particularly within the arts, wherever we look, we see technology playing this role, this new role, expanded role, a facilitative role in helping people do what we do. Now, I mean, here we are using our newly honed Zoom skills in ISPS online. And of course, this is what date nights perhaps looked like over the last year. In this case, we were watching a close-up magician who had taken what he used to do in person, something very essential to close-up magic, and crafted something entirely new that could only really be delivered through Zoom and online in people's own homes. At the same time, in the back there, you can see a digital picture frame showing family thousands of miles away that we couldn't contact. To the left, yet another screen playing the role of babysitter, replacing that human interaction that couldn't come in. So we've all had this experience, technology playing this expanded role in our lives. And we know coming into this, we've had this explosion of technology access in the home. 96% of households in the UK now have internet access. Obviously, quality varies, but is improving. 84% of adults over the age of 16 have a private smartphone, never mind perhaps one through work. This is extraordinary. The smartphones didn't exist 15 to 20 years ago. We know a very large percent of the public before the pandemic was already engaging with aspects of the arts online. We also know that there was this big push to bring together the arts and technological spaces. If one's to believe the UK's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, in their white paper published literally months before the pandemic, really calling for this coming together of these worlds, about the possibilities of it, but also highlighting a potential lack of digital skills within organizations, something that we've seen to various degrees over the last year or two when we were all put to the test in the pandemic. They also highlighted this link between those who are excluded from cultural events generally also tend to be the kind of people who are excluded from access to technology and digital tools. And we also know a wide range of research seeing that technology is seeing ever greater use generally in the arts. Some research we've done, for example, finding that even in that very perhaps traditional world of classical music, we still see an appetite for new technology so long as it's easy to use and useful. But where is the gap? So within the pandemic, we've been seeing data come out looking at people's technology use, but it's been coming from various aspects. Sometimes it's quite general, so technology use overall, and not specifically within the arts. Or we see technology use within very specific sectors, but not looking across various forms of arts and culture, or looking just at audiences or just at professionals, but not crossing that divide and making those comparisons. Also, often looking at convenience samples, perhaps sampling those already engaged with a particular venue, already engaged with a particular art form, not necessarily cutting across the wider population. So what we wanted to do is try to address all of those things. We wanted to look at public engagement with the arts generally across the UK, as well as engagements of arts professionals with technology. And we wanted to compare how they were using technology before the pandemic, how that changed during the pandemic, and crucially, did they predict that change in themselves persisting? Because we need to know to what degree do we need to maintain our investment in time and resource in these technological tools, or do we and other professionals and organizations, should we be planning to go back to how things were? We also wanted to see what technologies are people using and what do they have to engage with the arts? What are their attitudes towards these technologies and also technologies to come? And finally, what financial resources have they invested and are they willing to invest that might help, again, help professionals make those decisions? So I'll be focusing largely on our sample of the UK public. Now, with this sample, we really did want to be as representative as possible. So we commissioned the company Prolific, that was mentioned in an earlier presentation, to help us get that representative sample. Representative in quotation marks, because it wasn't 100% representative of UK demographics, but it was quite close. So we had 1,523 full responses to our technology survey, mean median age of 45 years. And as you can see, generally covering the sort of the demographic sort of divide of the UK quite nicely. A little older in that median age, because of course we were only including 18 and up in this particular sample. A nice even split of self-reported sex. 85% reporting as white, which matches quite closely with UK demographics, and another sort of dozen major sections represented somewhat comparatively to standard UK demographics. We were slightly different from UK demographics in terms of region and level of education, a little more south-focused in population, a little some more sort of higher education focused, but still a general dispersion across, as representative as we might hope to be in this context. So let's dig into the data. So we saw within the UK public general engagement across 5 major areas of arts that we looked: the visual arts, photography, painting, these kind of things, the performing arts, theater, drama, dance, music and related sound arts, literature, and then craft and decorative arts. You can see largely people were recipients of these arts, so taking them in as opposed to participating in them. So some, in particular, the visual arts and craft, people were more participatory. The data I'll be focusing on over the next 10 minutes or so will focus on people's technology use as they were receiving the arts that are being sort of provided to them by an arts professional, as it were. So let's start digging in. So first, how did people use technology before to engage with the arts? So in each of these graphs, you'll see the top line is entirely without technology, and then mostly without, and then equal to, and then mostly with, then entirely with, and some people indicating, well, actually, I didn't engage with this art form before the pandemic started. And what you can see is, generally speaking, we see a fair amount of technology used. Particularly, we can see higher amounts of technology being used in music, mostly with being the highest one. We can also see a lot of technology use in engaging with the visual arts. What really stands out here is the performing arts, dance, theater, drama, the lowest amount of technology use, a full quarter of people not using any technology whatsoever to engage with those art forms. And this is going to become important as we carry on. So that's technology used before the pandemic started. So a mix with performing arts using the least, music perhaps, some visual arts tending to more. So now if we turn to, well, how are the arts being used in the current practice? I'm sorry, the button to change the slide has just disappeared. It's very strange. Here we are. So change during the pandemic. So once again, we have less, first of all, just engagement with the arts. So technology aside for a moment, how are people engaging with the arts? You see a fairly consistent picture where people are either maintaining their engagement with the arts, if not some slightly increasing them, except again, that outlier, the performing arts, a full 23% of people stopping entirely their engagement with dance, theater, and drama, and 37% engaging much less with it. So within that context, if we look then to technology use, what we can see is that same picture, fairly even dispersion across literature, music, visual arts, and craft. That technology use is either the same or actually increasing by in 40% of people, 44% of people, 42% of people fairly consistently. But if we look to the performing arts, we in fact see 21% of people using even less technology than they were, probably aligned with just engaging with that art form less than the others. And then crucially, if we look to the future, so once again, a very consistent picture, more or less, between the visual arts, music, literature, and craft, that most people looking to maintain their engagement to the arts, if not slightly increase it going forward, that blue text to the right. But again, the performing arts, we have that much smaller proportion of people maintaining it, a much larger proportion of people wanting to increase it. So these are people that have stepped away over the pandemic and want to come back to it after the pandemic. However, if we look to technology use, we see where generally there's a positive picture of this extra technology use that audiences are engaging in. They seem to want to maintain that green same bar, if not even further increase it, that blue to the right. Well, the performing arts had the least desire to maintain that technology use, the most desire, twice as much in some cases as the other art forms, to revert back. So we see all the way through, performing arts is a bit of the standout, and that ties back to what perhaps what Netta was saying in the very first presentation, where we saw that 75% of those professionals in the performing arts were reporting lost income. The performing arts are being particularly hit by this difficulty of engaging with technology, and perhaps their audience's unwillingness, or just the lack of technology's ability to bridge that gap for the performing arts compared to other art forms. Now, we can also quickly look to see, can we predict generally people's intention to use technology going forward across the art forms? And we quickly looked at some basic demographic characteristics. Can we predict it based on their age, based on their income, based on their reported sex, or based on whether they hold a disability? Because we know in prior research that there's evidence that those with various disabilities have found new technologies more useful and engage with them more. And what we found was that actually age and income and disability did not predict it in this case. Sex did, in that males were slightly more likely to predict future use of technology, which sort of aligns with previous research and general cultural trends, but it was a small difference, so probably not something worth too much introspection about. On the disability point, I think it is worth noting that we did have representation across a number of self-reported disability areas within the study. So that's something that we will look into going forward, whether perhaps more fine-grained analyses show a connection there in line with previous literature. So now let's use the technology they use. Now I know there's a lot here, but all you have to do is look to the red lines poking out to see those are the areas where people don't have access to those technologies. And what do we see? We see at the bottom, for example, augmented reality and virtual reality consoles. Very few people have access here. You can also see on the top, very little access to, for example, smartwatches. But then if we look to the green lines, well, that's where people are using these technologies to engage with the arts. And what do we see? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, we're seeing screens and televisions, we're seeing smartphones, we're seeing headphones, we're seeing laptops. So very relatively traditional technologies as far as these technologies go. And crucially, that last one, acquired for the arts, you can see those tiny little purple lines there. Very few people in this sample purposely going and getting their hands on new technologies so that they could engage with the arts in the pandemic. People are using what they have, and we'll see that theme come up again. Now we can do the same thing with digital platforms that they use. So where you see those red lines, these are platforms they're not using. So at the top, for example, we see Twitter not using it so much, and particularly TikTok and Twitch not using it so much. Now here I might caveat that with the 18 and above nature of our sample, because we know that TikTok and Twitch are immensely popular within the sort of the teenage 13 and up crowd. So I think we have to caveat there with our particular sample. But we also crucially see very few people reporting engaging with individual organizations' websites of specific arts organizations or artists, for example. Where do people want to go? Well, look at the green lines. They're going to YouTube, music streaming sites, video streaming sites. We see this in some of the qualitative data we have as well. People want things in one place. They want convenience. They don't like jumping around between platforms and between services to engage with the arts. Now we'll continue on rapid fire through all these charts. We can now look at their attitudes to using it. And here we wanted to get a sense of that sort of emotional reaction to engaging with technology. What does it feel like as an audience member to engage with these technologies? So we asked them, well, how often do you find yourself feeling these things as you engage through technology with the arts? And what we find is a generally positive story. We're seeing high scores for sort of their interest, their engagement, the degree to which they're feeling relaxed, satisfied, fulfilled, for example. So those are the sort of the high bars, as it were, there. But then look to some of those low bars. We say, okay, well, that's good. Frustration seems to be low across the board. Well, we all have those frustrating moments, but generally frustration seems to be low. Loneliness seems to be low, but also connectedness, that's low. Emotional responses generally, that's low. And maybe that sort of aligns with our own experiences of this. The degree to which do we actually feel connected to people? But generally, this is a relatively positive picture. But what we can then do is compare this directly and ask people directly, well, compare using the technology to the real world equivalent. And we get a slightly different story. So again, look to the green lines. That's where we see people feeling that emotion much more when they're in person and using technology. And what do we see rising to the top? Connection with others, engagement with what we're doing, to some degree higher up, immersion in what we're doing. Whereas the blue lines are showing, okay, what does technology sort of provide that being there in person doesn't? Well, we see distraction, loneliness, frustration. So there are those sort of familiar emotions and maybe those experiences we've had with technology this past year or two coming to the fore. So on their own, general positive attitudes to technology, but when you put it into the context of people's real world analogs, technology still has a long way to go to feel like a positive replacement or alternative or enhancement of those experiences. Then we can ask people, well, where you don't use technology and also where you don't anticipate yourself using new technologies in the future, well, why not? Now here we generally saw fairly low scores for people sort of feeling that these barriers generally apply to them, but we can still sort of rank them, put them in order and see which are the strongest barriers. And what do we see? Well, people's just experience with technology is a barrier. Generally, people want to use the things they already know how to use. Another high one is just screen time. People feeling they're spending too much screen time on screens, they don't want to spend more. And also just the general expense of new technologies and engaging with technology. And then you can sort of follow that across the board. Their interest in it, their access to it, their awareness of what's available, privacy concerns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Surprisingly, internet connectivity issues in last place. That might perhaps be the fact that our sample was had slightly higher education, also slightly higher financial income, household income than the general population might be skewing that slightly. And we're like, well, what technology do people want? Well, what do they want in new tech? They want good audio video quality, and they want to be on devices that they already own that are easy to use and keep privacy concerns in mind. At the bottom end of that spectrum, technology that lets them engage with the artists and audiences, which is a bit odd. So people are saying that, yeah, I don't feel engaged with audiences in new tech. But then we ask them, well, do you want that in new tech? That also seems to score low. Is that paradoxical, or is that just what people are used to? And finally, and this is a bit depressing, let's go to finances. What we see is generally little spent across, when we ask people, how much did you spend on each of these across the entire pandemic so far? So depending on how one interprets it, over a year. On average, £169 across all domains spent. And if we look at the median values, the median value for a lot of these being actually just zero. There are some extreme outliers, as you can see in the maps, but I think by most interpretations, quite little being spent on the arts and on new technologies to engage with the arts across the pandemic. And I'm afraid it gets worse, because when you ask people, well, did your disposable income go up or down during the pandemic? Well, yes, it went down. Is it going to change after the pandemic? Yeah, people are not enthused. They think they're going to have even less disposable income after the pandemic. And how will that affect art spend? Well, they felt that generally it sort of balanced out art spent during the pandemic compared to before, some more, some less. But going forward, people think they're going to spend even less on the arts than they already do compared to those low numbers we just saw in the last slide. Now, I mentioned that we surveyed professionals as well. We're not going to go into these data because they actually quite match quite closely with what we've already seen. Just to say, we do have a sample of 809 professionals. This is a global sample, sort of more of a convenient sample in this case, largely the UK, but also the US, Mexico, Portugal, Poland, highly represented. Across the 5 arts, so the visual arts actually quite well represented. We're going to be continuing to dig into this data. The trends we see are largely similar in terms of attitudes and use. Be curious to hear your thoughts on where we should dig in. One comparison to make, for example, is if we look again at what people want in their technology, rated from high to low in those light blue, if we map what the creators want, well, it maps closely, but you see the creators do tend to be more interested in being creative and also wanting to engage with audiences and creators. But again, it's still on the low end of their preference. You can see that's on the low side. So again, we have this paradox, people not feeling connected with tech, but also not necessarily wanting more out of it. So to wrap up, Technology use is strong and increasing, and people seem to want to keep it, if not increase it going forward, with the performing arts being an outlier, being a bit hard hit there. We see that traditional technologies remain dominant. We see that tech is generally viewed positively on its own, but less so in comparison with others. We've talked about the main barriers, and a particular one being the lack of financial investment in these things. So that brings us to the end of the talk. I mentioned these two other work packages. As we continue with this project, we're also going to be looking to highlight innovative use of technology and also just innovations within the arts in general, how to push through this, and as well as having our own work package designed to innovate new uses of technology within the arts, up against these paradoxes where, yes, people want more tech, but they're skeptical about what it can do and spending money on it. And it's these paradoxes that we're looking forward to having your feedback on and helping us untangle. So with that, I'll thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, George. Are there questions or comments from the audience? Checking the chat. Yeah, Jennifer.
Hi, George. Good afternoon. Thanks very much for the presentation. And I was really intrigued to see how people were using technology more and seemed to be quite enthusiastic about it, but then didn't think that they weren't going to purchase it in the future, and they weren't going to use a lot of income. So the kind of future outlook looks a bit bleak. But perhaps that's just, that's the space for innovation, hopefully. What I was going to say is, how does this compare with some of the data that's being collected? Are you aware of the Audience Outlook Monitor? I know that's something that goes on in Australia, and I'm sure it goes on in a few other different countries. Because the message they seem to be saying is one that's maybe a bit more optimistic from the future outlook. And I was wondering if there was differences within the sample that would explain that a little bit, or if there was kind of more detail behind the questions that you've been asking.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question, Jenny. And I mean, I think what we tried to do, particularly by looking across several areas of the arts, in particular, picking out things like the performing arts, where we see that as an outlier, I think that's, it's quite indicative. I don't think anyone here needs any explanation as to why it is that things like theater and drama and the circus arts are hard to bring into technological spaces. My sense, feel free to correct me, and maybe others here can, is when we look at these general audience indicators of the arts, often what's being lumped into that, it is an art form, but what's being included in that is how much Netflix people are watching and how much engagement with television, film, these kind of things, streaming services online. And I think there are reasons to be positive if you own Spotify, if you own Apple, if you have stock in Netflix, right? As we've talked about in some of the previous sessions, it's to what degree is that making its way back to the creators? And it's why we wanted to look across the audiences and the creators. But then again, there are these sort of art forms that are forgotten. In fact, I was just speaking yesterday to our puppeteer in residence, how even within the performing arts, the puppeteers are feeling particularly forgotten, because how on earth can they do what they do without being able to meet in spaces where actually safety at work regulations mean they can't even get as close as they need to get to manipulate the puppets. So I think, I mean, I'm generally an optimist. I see optimism in our numbers as well as in those ones you cite, in that, yes, we're learning new tech. We see ourselves using this forward, but I think, what we want to do is to not gloss over the real challenges, that there are certain art forms where this is going to be really difficult. And also, yeah, there's just this huge barrier to people paying for it. We're so used to so much entertainment and tech being free, or the things that we have already. But I'm glad you mentioned innovation. I know that's something, close to your heart as well as mine, that, perhaps the challenge is people just can't really imagine what that next technology is going to be. And when we look at our qualitative data, that's what we see. Because we ask people, if you could have anything, what should we build you? And we have tens of thousands of words to this effect. And most of them say, I don't know, I can't really imagine it. We sort of have what we have, and it sort of works. And a lot of people cite VR because they sort of know about it. But yeah, I think actually really strong innovation is going to be needed to help sort of overcome this. I hope that very roundabout ways to address.
Thanks, George. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in with a quick question stroke comment, Geordie, about the the findings on the feelings of, or the lack of feeling of connectedness and the sort of emotional engagement, and what your sort of take is on how we might address that, like especially in relation to the performing arts, where people's views were slightly less optimistic, perhaps, or people were struggling more to engage. Did you have any sort of sense of how we might take that optimistic sort of view to developing new ways of engagement that do feel more connected and more emotionally sort of satisfying?
I think there's a lot of hope in the industry that augmented reality, virtual reality is going to be our savior. I tend on my more optimistic days to think that's going to be the case. There is something about that embodied sense of space and having people around, and that's just how our brains work. We can tell the difference between you two-dimensional people in front of me and physical people around me. As we saw in the survey, however, very, very few people have any access to VR equipment, and people are really hesitant to buy new things and adopt new things. So it's going to have to be so easy to use, and it's also going to rely on the same, perhaps, explosion of VR tech that we saw in smartphones, for example. I'd be interested in others' perspectives on that. I think having at least one sort of shining light on the horizon of a technology is how I at least try to stay optimistic. But perhaps there's things that we completely haven't foreseen that maybe others here are aware of in development.
And Caitlin, I think you'd like to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, obviously the sample was above 18, but did you see any patterns in terms of age? Because I think there's generally a feeling among the people that I interviewed that Twitch and gaming have a real transfer over to the arts that isn't really being utilized at the moment. And were young people engaging, were the younger age group engaging more with that than the others, did you see?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we'll have to carry on some more of these sort of age comparisons throughout. So the Wayne, when I started, found no relationship whatsoever with at least intention to engage with more technology. But we'll have to sort of dig in, as you say, and look at just current engagement. The fact, you mentioned Twitch, the fact that Twitch was so unused and TikTok was so unused really does suggest there is a separate demographic of that sort of 13 to 18 that will have to be considered separately that we haven't in this case, because all the data suggests that they are incredibly active on those platforms. And the fact we don't see it here really suggests, yeah, there's something different happening there that we're not capturing here.
Unless they don't realize that they're engaging with the arts.
Perhaps it could just be a matter of how they conceive it. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
George, I mean, the low spend on digital arts aligns with the general expectation that we talked about before, that the arts should be free. Yeah. And I keep coming back to this point that that's a perception issue, sort of public understanding of what it costs to make art. And I wonder if, there are many, obviously, organizations like Society of Authors, et cetera, Musicians Union, how effective the advocacy is for the individual artist to be empowered. I mean, for a start, you have to pay joining fees if you join one of the unions. An awful lot of creatives can't afford to do that. It's like for authors, it's £111 a year or whatever. And they do a fantastic job, the union. But there's this, I guess Marcus Rashford's activism was going through my mind when I was listening to this, how quickly the whole world became engaged in something that was, after all, very obvious, children getting fed. But nobody really thought about it in great detail or put some pressure on. Is there evidence of activism that artists actually can step outside and really push the agenda here? Look, you want this stuff, it's keeping you alive, it's keeping you civilized, but you're not paying for it.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps even related to Jenny's question earlier, I think there are certain art forms and certain populated groups of professionals that have better representation, have louder voices, have stronger connections. Though I think there's a higher level sort of fundamental failing in many countries on this. And for everyone's time, I won't go into my rant now. I'll only highlight the fact that, for example, we know the massive contribution that arts and culture makes to, for example, the UK economy. It's the same in Canada, the same in the US. More than a lot of major industries combined, ones you would think of being these heavy hitters. And yet what the governments then do is they look at people's incomes, right? And they see, oh, look at this, artists aren't making very much money. So maybe a sensible person might do, oh, these people are providing this really important skill, they're contributing to the economy, never mind the social health and well-being benefits, they would help boost incomes. But instead what happens, they go, oh, well, let's cut funding to education. Let's discourage people from going into this in the first place and send everybody into STEM because you make more money there. So they're sort of exacerbating the problem. They see this problem of low wages as, oh, there's too many artists, not that, oh, these artists are providing a very valuable service, but the system is fundamentally underpaying them. And this is the thing we're all up against, and any ideas anyone has to help, you know, shift that voice and that policy is going to be beneficial to all of us and the whole industry, I think.
I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to interject to thank George, but also to thank you, and please join me in thanking all of the speakers from this session, Netta, Caitlin, and George. Thank you very much for your contributions. There is a 30-minute break now, and then the symposium on the impact of COVID-19 on arts professionals will continue, as well as the other thematic sessions. Thank you all, and lovely to see you.